Welcome to our show called Inside the Bible, produced here at Andrews University. I'm joined today on set, as always, by my friends Felicia Dattis and Andrew Abbott.
Welcome again, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us, and remember, we want to connect with you. So use your smartphone, your devices, and connect with us on Facebook, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. You are a part of this journey, but we also want you to invite your family members and your friends. Send in your questions, your comments, your experience of reading the Bible. We want to hear from you.
There's something about disaster that seems to capture the human imagination. We can see disaster themes in many of today's movies. Warfare, disease, unscrupulous technology, and natural calamities sends everyone running for cover. And a big part of the drama comes from the fact that a crisis tends to either call out the best or the worst in human beings. And in today's episode, we're going to look at the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus and look for a deeper purpose behind these disasters.
There are few narratives as fascinating as the 10 plagues of Egypt. Hollywood has already produced several movies about it, and I'm sure if time lasts, they will make more. But our task is to explore the text and science for answers.
So why did God send these plagues? Wasn't there another way to solve the problem? Well, I hope you're ready to get in on the investigation. I am, because it starts right now.
God's call in the desert opened up a frightening new reality for Moses. His life changed from tending sheep quietly in a forgotten corner of the wilderness to being thrust into the center of Pharaoh's court as a representative of God. At the burning bush, God did give Moses several assurances, and he even displayed his power for Moses right there. But Moses still faced the challenge of confronting the Pharaoh and his team of magicians with God's word. How was God going to display his power in convincing the Pharaoh? How would God's power compare with the supposed power of the magicians in Pharaoh's court? What special meaning would God's power have for the Egyptians when it was on display? Robert and I sat down with several scholars to dig up some answers.
Today we're talking about Moses, specifically in the context of the plagues and the Exodus. The first one we're going to talk about specifically is about the Egyptians. We know that there's a movie that just came out, not too long ago, about this whole situation, about this Exodus. I think it's called, Exodus, Gods and Kings, right? What do you think modern media portrays? Let's start with that. What do you think it portrays about the story of the Exodus?
Well, sorry. I actually saw the movie, and the way they kind of portray God is, it's interesting because he pops up as a child, but it's almost like he's an angry child, and he's angry because these Egyptians have taken his people, and it's almost like a disrespect to him. So because he feels disrespected, he in turn is angry and then wants to kill all of the Egyptians and just embarrass them in the craziest ways. And it's funny, they go through the different plagues, and it's even violent the way he does it.
Yeah, and I think it's the way it's typically been, in our societal narratives, in our Hollywood movies. We tend to view everything from the glass of antagonist and protagonist. So in the Hollywood portrayals, it's always the Egyptians are bad guys. They're bad guys, and God doesn't like the Egyptians.
Black and white, huh?
Yeah, exactly. But from when you pull out a million miles to God's perspective, the Egyptians are his children just as much as the Hebrews are his children, and he wants ultimately through his actions to find a way to save them as well.
Yeah, I think that sometimes not sometimes, most of the times we read the Bible through our eyes, through our modern eyes, and we kind of portray and kind of project our culture on their culture. And when we think of all the atrocities in the Old Testament, we think of them with the sensibility of a modern man who thinks of human rights and equality and all that, and that's very good. It's noble. I agree with all that, but they did not back then. So God has to deal. God chose to limit himself. It's not like he cannot do that, anything about it, but he chose to limit himself by the free will of humans, and by the level of their development. He doesn't want to pull them out of their culture immediately, so he has to work with what he has. It was their mentality. So if they understood that, that's what he has to work with.
Yeah, and the Hebrews at this point have been with the Egyptians as slaves for I think about 300 years.
Yeah, about 400 actually.
Yeah, and they've been just steeped in this idol worshiping culture. In paganism, yeah, and so they have such a small concept of the things they used to know, and so God's he has to start from square one and start teaching from scratch.
Yeah.
When Hollywood depicts the 10 plagues that fell upon the Egyptians before Israel left for the land of Canaan, we see that there's a number of different themes that play into these stories as they're depicted on the screen. First of all, when we look at the Prince of Egypt, we see that this is clearly a divine event. There's a sickly glow that falls from the heavens and goes from house to house when the angel of death is taking the lives of the firstborn of the Egyptians. And just with the demeanor of the Pharaoh, we see there's clearly a sense of pride that's at play here. The innocent are suffering because of his stubbornness, and even just the divine element pops up in a lot of different scenes where someone's taking a drink of water and literally it turns to blood right on his lips. And beyond that, if we look at a more modern film, we can see in Exodus, Gods and Kings that same cataclysmic idea is there. This is a disaster for the Egyptians, but they have a little different twist on it, where some of the plagues have more of a natural feel. We see fishermen in the Nile River who are being gobbled up by giant crocodiles. Blood is all over the place. And in other plagues, there's clearly a sense in which the plague pops up, but it's not totally clear as to whether the supernatural element is as plain as it was in the Prince of Egypt. But we can see how it's definitely a hugely grand epic that's come together with Christian Bale, put out by 20th Century Fox Films. And the same could be said of the film The Ten Commandments as well, where Charlton Heston stars there, and is directed by Cecil DeMille as well. And clearly in that film, we could see that there's a confrontation here between God and the gods of Egypt, especially in the scene where the two of them are facing off, Ramses, the Pharaoh, and Moses by the Nile River. As the Nile River turns to blood, Pharaoh tries to cure the water by pouring out a special magic potion, but the water turns to blood as he's pouring it out of the jar. God is triumphing over the gods of Egypt and showing his power. And if we could say something that there's something that ties all these films together, we could point to the element that they include, which is the friendship between Moses and Ramses the Pharaoh before Moses rebels from the authority of the Pharaoh at that time and heads to the land of Midian. So there's this dynamic of these two former brothers facing off with the different power that's behind each of them, and God clearly triumphs in the end.
Standing 17 feet 4 inches tall, weighing nearly 6 tons, this statue of the king Tutankhamun is the tallest Egyptian statue in this part of the world. Tutankhamun, everyone knows, was the famous boy king whose tomb was found nearly intact by Howard Carter in the early parts of the 1900s in the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun was a king near the end of the 18th dynasty. The 18th dynasty was the first dynasty in the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt, also the dynasty from which the Exodus took place. The grandeur we see in a statue like this reminds us what the Hebrews saw on a daily basis. The Egyptians could carve monumental gods and kings out of stone granite, but only God could take them to a mountain made of the same stuff and then fill the whole mountain with his presence. It was important for the Egyptians and the Hebrews to both understand who God was and what a real God was. And that's why God took such a long time to deliver the Hebrews with 10 plagues. when God met with the Hebrews, he could have easily taken them out of Egypt. He didn't need 10 plagues.
In Egypt, everything centered around the concept
to them. And so they had their own set of gods, but then all of a sudden, all of these gods are somehow challenged in terms of their power.
Herodotus, a Greek historian living in the 5th century BC, claimed that the Egyptians were the most religious people in the world. He said this based on the number of deities they worshipped and the vast temples and small chapels that littered the country. Today, some Egyptologists count more than 1,500 gods and goddesses that remain in the archaeological record. That is astounding. To say that the Egyptians were religious would be like to say that they lived. Every aspect of life was governed by a deity of some sort. So when Moses came and by the power and in the name of God unleashed plagues upon that country, it is certain that many of those deities were affected. Can this be a simple coincidence? How might we understand this?
So topic 2 is about how the plagues that Moses was involved in with the Egyptians and God, how did that affect the theology of the Egyptians? In what way did it challenge them? Chris?
I think, first of all, looking at the Egyptians, it's important to understand that they weren't like an evil people. Yeah. They weren't some kind of, whenever we think of Egyptians, they're like these pagan evil people that hate God and all this kind of stuff. I'm sure that in past dealings, they might have come in contact with God, especially in, like Joseph and everything. But this was an unknown God to them. And so they had their own set of gods. But then all of a sudden, all of these gods are somehow challenged in terms of their power.
So you're saying each plague challenged a specific god?
Right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's only natural, I think, for people to fight back against, challenge against your deeply held beliefs. Right. So it's going to take a lot.
We all do that.
Yeah, sure. So God was going to have to work very hard to break through to these people, because these were deeply held.
Yeah. As I said before, we always think when we read the Bible, we think through our own mind mentality. Because I always wondered. Now, why would the Egyptians go after the Israelites? Didn't they see how powerful God was? How could they stand against him? Well, from their mentality was like, our God's against this God, our God's against this God. And all of a sudden, the pillar goes, and they're free. And it's, our gods have finally won. Let's beat them. So they had this polytheistic mentality. It was not the way we think. So God of the Hebrews was just one of them.
Well, in ancient Egypt, everything was centered around the gods. They're very religious people. And so every object, every color, everything was somehow connected to a god. So when the plagues came, they hit right at the very heart of ancient Egypt and its culture. They attacked everything that was valuable to them. And they must have been thrown into absolute confusion to find these plagues taking place, which they could not see any reason for which they had done anything. And the reason why this is significant is because in Egypt, everything centered around the concept of Mat. Mat is an idea that's kind of hard to explain in English, but in ancient Egypt, it sort of had the idea of justice, or the idea of balance, and all of these things together, this sort of concept that to keep things whole. And the central person responsible for maintaining Mat was the king, was the Pharaoh. He was the living god Horus who lived on earth, and his job was to maintain this balance. So each of these challenges that Moses made was a direct challenge of Pharaoh as king and as gods, and a challenge to all of the gods and his ability to maintain the balance. Each plague attacked that balance in one way or another. Well, the first attack was on the Nile River itself. Now, Herodotus referred to the Nile River as the life of Egypt. So here you have the most important thing in all of Egypt is the Nile. And the reason for this is that every year, starting around July 15th, the Nile began to flood. When we think of a flood, it's something that happens all of a sudden, destroys everything. But for Egypt, it brought life. What it brought was the kemet, that rich black soil, that fertile, rich soil in which all of their crops were grown. So the Nile referred to the renewing of the land. So when that plague attacked the Nile, turned it red with blood, whatever that may have been, whether it was algae or actual physical blood, we don't really know for sure what that meant, but we do know that it killed all of the fish in the Nile, which was devastating to have all of the fish die. And it attacked the Nile as the central life-giving force of ancient Egypt. But one thing you may not realize, the frog is a very important symbol. Heka is the name of the frog goddess, and that frog goddess is responsible for fertility and fecundity and the power of the living force that the Nile brings. It was known in ancient time because it would produce so many offspring, tadpoles that we would refer to them, and small frogs and so on. So it was known for that sort of fertility. This was a direct attack on fertility. When they came out, they weren't going to try to kill them, because this was a symbol of the health of the Nile, the health of their whole country. So they were basically have to live with frogs in your living room, which would be kind of an awkward situation.
The Egyptians saw their gods in nature, manifested in nature. For example, the Apis bull. The Apis bull was a physical manifestation of the god Ptah, the creator god who spoke the world into existence. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, the goddess of plagues. Hathor, the mother goddess, the goddess of fertility. When God met with the Hebrews, he could have easily taken them out of Egypt. He didn't need 10 plagues. So why did God take 10 plagues in Egypt? Might it have been to not just show the Hebrews what God was, but to also show the Egyptians? Think of what an Egyptian thought of as a god. It was something in nature that they could talk to, but wouldn't necessarily respond back to them. On the other hand, the Egyptians and the Hebrews both could witness a man, Moses, speaking to a king about something that was going to happen in nature, and it happened. And then he could speak again and it would stop. God wanted to show what true divinity meant, more than just a bird of nature.
Egypt prided itself on its army and its ability to protect its borders. These flies were a symbol that your borders are no longer protected by the gods.
Chapter 7, particularly verse 5, says that through the plagues, through these miracles that God's going to show, he's actually going to introduce himself in this way to the Egyptians.
In the third and fourth plagues, you had the gnats or insects of some kind, and then the flies, and they're related to each other. What you have now is this sort of abundance of insects that are just coming out of everywhere. Well, that is a sign of one of the most important things in ancient Egypt. These insects or these flies were not considered to be the annoying pest that we think of them. Indeed, in ancient Egypt, if you were a supreme military commander or you showed that you were very successful in battle, maybe you were very brave, they would actually give you, as an honor from the king, a necklace that had flies on it. Not just any flies, but they were gold flies. And what they symbolize, it's kind of like getting the Medal of Honor or the Medal of Valor that showed just how much strength and power you had in battle. So when these flies came, they were a symbol that attack on the strength and power of Egypt as a nation of valor and of a strong military might. And that was a problem because Egypt prided itself on its army and its ability to protect its borders. These flies were a symbol that your borders are no longer protected by the gods.
Most people think of the of the plagues as being a way for God to free the Hebrews from Egypt. But is that really what he's doing? I mean, after all, a God who could send 10 plagues, couldn't he send all of them at one time? Why would he spread them out? Well, Moses has this same kind of question in Exodus chapter 5. At the very, very end, this is after the bricks to straw story. He comes to God and says, basically, what are you doing? I've been here for a couple days now, and it's only gotten worse. You know, how are you going to free them? And then chapter 6 and the very beginning of chapter 7, God explains exactly why he's taking time. The first part of it is really to help the Hebrews understand what he's doing. But then, surprisingly, chapter 7, particularly verse 5, says that through the plagues, through these miracles that God's going to show, he's actually going to introduce himself in this way to the Egyptians. Just imagine, the Egyptians had, we know in archaeology at least, over 1,500 gods and goddesses. Every aspect of their life was God's. The sun, the air they breathed, the ground they walked on, the emotions they felt, everything was in some way, personified maybe is the wrong word, but it was deified in some way to become a god.
So if I hear you correctly here, it's like their entire lifestyle was unified in the element of gods and goddesses, and that whole, we could say, pantheon of deities that they had was kind of what brought all the different aspects of life together for them.
If you think about it, I mean, we wouldn't have to even guess. Numbers 33 verse 4 specifically says the plagues were brought on them to counteract or to battle the gods of Egypt. But just think what was happening, because God's not interested in fighting an imaginary God. It's not what he's doing. What would he be doing? Well, if you're an Egyptian and you believe that the sun is a god, the god Ra, the god Aten, or the god, whatever form of the sun god you want it to be, and you believe it's a god, and you pray to that god to ask it to do something, and the sun, of course, as the sun doesn't do anything to respond back to you, your perception of what a god is much different than the God that's described in the Hebrew text. The God described in the Hebrew text is a God that when someone says something, he responds. And now you have a God coming, and you have a Moses, a man standing there, or Aaron, and Moses and Aaron, standing there, and they're saying something in the name of God, and then it actually happens. And in fact, it happens against or to stop the natural flows of nature to one or many of the Egyptian gods. It's a completely different perspective on what it's not only helping the Hebrews understand who God is, it's helping the Egyptians understand what a real God should be.
For them, seeing a God who could actually come into nature and actually upset all this natural balance and all these processes that they had taken stock in, that must have been just a horrifying but surprising and enlightening experience for them.
It would have. Not only would it have disrupted their lives, but it would have actually disrupted their worldview, so to speak. Sometimes when we think in the Western minds of gods, we think of the Roman or the Greek gods. We might think of Mesopotamian type gods where they're very chaotic and warlike, and you have to appease them in some way. The Egyptian gods weren't really like that. At least it doesn't appear to be that way. They were more on the side of the Egyptians. But now, when the water is no longer there, now it's blood. Now your crops aren't growing, or this hail coming down from the sky, and all these different things that are happening. Now you start to wonder, well, who are these gods? Is my God doing this to me? This isn't who this God was supposed to be.
Wow.
Well, maybe it really is this other God. Another thing to remember is that gods in the ancient world were very local. Every country had their god or gods that was associated with their country. And so for a foreign god, a god of the desert people, the Asiatics, to come into Egypt and be stronger than the Egyptian gods is completely upsets their world, what's supposed to actually happen in their world. It is easy to dismiss a story such as this as myth. I mean, after all, what is written here is nothing short of incredible. This is further compounded when the story is taken out of context and then explained. We saw today how important context is to have the perspective the story intends for us to have. It was clear that God was reaching out to both the Hebrews and the Egyptians in the early plagues, but not all of them wanted to hear this message.
We can see that the plagues were meant to show the worthlessness of the Egyptian gods. The pagan gods were powerless to protect their worshippers from the plagues. And today, we unfortunately still have our share of idols, objects, activities, or ideas that absorb our attention instead of focusing us on God. And there are definitely times when these idols will get challenged or toppled over. And the question is, how are we going to respond when we face an idol toppling challenge? Will we be able to stand because of our trust in God?
So, what are your thoughts on the plagues? Connect with us on Facebook. Go to our page, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. Send your questions. Give us your experience. What were your thoughts when you read over the story of the 10 plagues? And of course, ask your family members and your friends to join us on the journey.
In our next episode, we are going to continue exploring the plagues. So far, no one has died. As this changes, we have some tough questions to ask. If God is love, why is he described as sending disasters destined to devastate? Is God vengeful? You won't want to miss what we find next. Join us in our search for answers as we go inside the Bible.
God, he wants to test who's really for him and who's not, who really loves him and who's really willing to change and obey him, and who's just not.
I mean, that's a pretty heavy blow to have as a nation, your future wiped out in one night.
Whatever the situation was, this was personal, and it was meant to be personal.
Does it show, for instance, that God is merciful? Or does it show that he is the complete opposite, that he's revengeful and he wants to zap you if you go out of line?